Think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Move it back. We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
You don't need a science degree or a PhD to follow James's lecture, because then he went on to teach physics A-level to kids at Doncaster College, and that's the level that this talk is at, and that is the whole point of James's talk, is that anybody doing A-level at Doncaster College should be able to see that the official story of 9/11 is a load of rubbish. James.
Right then, well, it is A-level that I'm going to be dealing with. It's kind of, A-level makes it sound harder than it is maybe. It's probably more sort of AS level that we'll be dealing with. And the reason why, I just want to mention why physics is actually important to this whole debate, really. What I'm going into is the physics of the collapse of the tower specifically, and why deal with the physics of it? Well, two reasons really. The first reason is that, in actual fact, that's what FEMA and NIST were dealing with, because the material evidence, of course, was shifted away. So we have this, here we've got Bill Manning of Fire Engineering magazine, and what he's saying is basically he's complaining that all the forensic analysis can't be done. So he says it's a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces. So this is January 2002. This is just a few months before the FEMA report on the building collapse.
What's FEMA?
FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who were the first people to look at, to do the investigation, but they basically helped to clear it all up or cover it all up or whatever. So that's one reason. The other reason is that, of course, if there is a problem with the physics of what we're being told, then we can be sure that there's a very serious problem indeed, because physics doesn't lie. If the physics is wrong, then we can be sure that there's a problem. So, okay, so what I want to do, in a way, is do a kind of review of different approaches that people have taken looking into this, the physics of the collapse of these towers, and challenging the FEMA and the NIST analysis that came later. And there's basically these four different things that we can consider. The first one is conservation of linear momentum. Then there's conservation of energy. Then there's this question of the production of molten steel. And then finally, close to free-fall collapse rate. And it's interesting that there's this talk of close to. We'll come to how close to later. So what I'm going to do is all these are linked in ways anyway. I'm going to move through them. And as we go down, we'll find that, firstly, they get easier to understand, hopefully. And secondly, they become more and more important, I think, really. Okay, so I'm going to start with conservation of momentum. And this is the hardest one for me to explain to you, but basically the gist of it is, I'll start with the simplest idea, okay? If you have a pancake collapse, this is where one floor slams into another floor, and then there's two floors move together and slam into another floor, and so on. If we start with one floor and it hits the second floor, then basically at that point, there has to be conservation of momentum. And that means that if this floor's moving with a certain velocity, then when they two move off together, they have to have the same momentum, and therefore they have to have half the velocity. So there's a slowing at the point of collision. And then if you come to the next floor down, you get another slowing. Although that slowing's a little bit less. It's actually the three will move off with 2/3 of whatever the two hit them. Okay? So what that tells you is then that you can't have free fall speeds if you've got this series of collisions. So this was one of the arguments that was put forward as to why the original FEMA analysis didn't add up, basically. But the problem with this is a number of things, I think. One problem with it is that FEMA never actually claimed that it was like one floor hitting another floor. What they claimed was it was a whole building above the impact zone, which is where the plane hit, collapsing and acting like a pile driver. And in that situation, this effect, because you've got so much momentum at the top, the effect's going to be a lot less. So the slowing's not going to be so significant. So that's one thing. So the argument, in a way, doesn't really challenge the free fall collapse particularly. But then there's another issue, the other way around, which is that actually, what about the structural forces? Because this idea of linear momentum assumes that basically these floors are just kind of floating there. If you like, if I turned it around this way, it'd be like a bunch of billiard balls and one hits the other. And it's like there's nothing actually stopping them falling. But of course there is. There's a whole building holding them up. So for various reasons, the conservation of momentum, I don't think is a good approach, really. Although it is relevant, it is interesting. But basically you need to know a lot about the collapse mechanism. And that's complicated. And in a way, what I was looking for when I started to look into this was a more simple way of dealing with it. And this certainly isn't a simple way. Okay, so this was the idea that occurred to me immediately. Was why deal with conservation of momentum, where basically you've got a series of events, because each time there's a collision between floors, that's an event, and you've got to do a calculation, essentially. Okay? Why do that when you can look at the conservation of energy? Because with conservation of energy, if you know the energy at the start, then that must be the amount of energy you have at the end. So if you know basically how much energy you need to produce the results, you can see if you've got enough at the start. Okay, so you've got a test here that's quite simple, essentially. It's relatively easy to calculate the initial available energy. Okay, and I'll come to that. And this time, we don't have to worry about structural forces. Okay, it doesn't matter exactly how the building is destroyed in terms of dealing with conservation of energy. That's one of the beauties of using this law. So we don't need to know about that. We don't need to know about the collapse mechanism. However, the problem is that there is a complication, and that is we need to know how much energy we need to produce these results we find. And that means how much energy we need to pulverize all that concrete, because most of the building was broken to pieces into very small, fine bits of concrete. And we need to know how much energy is required to break apart all the girders or the bolts or whatever. I mean, these buildings were torn apart, and we need to know how much energy was required to do that. Now, it could be done. Somebody could do this, and I think people have, possibly. But I've never found an account that I'm really sure of. I don't know how to do it, okay? So I left that one. And I moved on to the next thing, which is this, the discovery of molten steel. And there's lots and lots of reports, eyewitness accounts and so on, that there was molten steel discovered underneath the towers, in the rubble of the towers, both 1 and 2, and also 7, I gather. Now, the question is, how could you have molten steel produced? Well, the obvious answer is that the fires must have produced the molten steel. But the catch is that the fires that we had were jet fuel at the hottest, and jet fuel can only burn at 1100 degrees C. That's what NIST say, so that's what the people investigating say. But to have molten steel, we need fires of 1500 degrees C. So we've obviously got a serious problem here. And I think this is the first real serious problem that's simple to understand, and you can say, hang on a minute, how can you possibly explain this? So I looked around, you know, and you look at the debunking sites and see what they have to say. And one of the answers I came across was, maybe this steel wasn't melted just by heating, because you can't heat something hotter than the thing that's heating it. Okay, that's one of the rules of physics. But maybe it was heated further by work. So as the building was ripped apart, you know, things were bent and you know, crushed or whatever, and all these actions, you know, if you take a piece of metal and you keep bending it around, it gets hotter and hotter. So maybe we could account for it in terms of the work done. So that was one suggestion. So I thought, okay, well, this is something I can actually have a go at. I can do my own calculation. I can have a bit of a stab at this one. I did what in physics you call a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Okay, this isn't like I couldn't present this at a conference, but it's the sort of thing physicists do when they have a coffee break. Okay, I tried to be fair about it. So I assume that I basically go for the upper estimate. Okay, so I assume that every last drop of energy, as it's all the energy that's in the building, remember it's all gravitational potential, after it's ripped the building apart, I assume that all of it actually heats the steel as well. So I take the gravitational potential energy, which is the thing on the left, the mass of the building times G, times H divided by 2. There's some assumptions here I'll come to in a minute. And I assume that all that goes into melting the steel. So I've got the mass of the steel, the specific heat capacity of steel, and the change in temperature. Okay, and I just wonder what change in temperature can I get if all of that potential energy goes into heating the steel. And just before I tell you the answer, by the way, here's why it's an upper limit estimate. Okay, one thing is that the actual centre of mass is below halfway, so I've exaggerated how much energy is available. NIST actually have their own value on the potential energy of the building. If I use their number, I get a 40% lower value than my number. So keep that in mind. A significant part of the building lies in the foundations and basements. That's another reason why the potential energy isn't as big as I'm estimating. Then there's other things, like the concrete was actually reduced to dust, of course. So as the building was collapsing, some of that energy would have just floated off. Okay, well, I can't account for that. Some of the energy, of course, was actually absorbed in the concrete. It didn't make the steel hotter, it would have made the concrete hotter, or the air hotter. Can't account for that. I'm assuming it all goes into the steel. And the other thing is, of course, the ground, there were tremors when the buildings fell. So, you know, and it rocked other buildings. So some of the energy obviously went into other places. So what's the answer I get? Well, I get an answer of 20 degrees centigrade. That's what I get. If I use NIST's number, I get 8 degrees. Okay? That's for the twin towers. That's for the tall ones. If we do the same thing for building 7, then basically, because it's half the height, assuming that all the composition of the building is the same, so the mass of the building to mass of steel ratio is the same, then we would expect it to be half the amount, so 10 degrees. Okay? Or if I use the NIST number, that would be 4 degrees. So in other words, basically, no. The work done, as far as I can see, I think it's reasonable to say, even though it's a back-of-the-envelope calculation, it's not adding up. Okay? As a little plug, that's my website, by the way. So if you want to read more about what I have to say about 9/11 generally, but this is on it. Okay, so.